So let me very quickly introduce the first two speakers out of three who prepared the first presentation. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Farah Yamini, who's digitally with us, but probably won't come on camera, Raymond, Awadzi, and Jack Vertovec, all of whom have come to us from the Florida International University in Miami. Two speakers belong to the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, and Farah Yamini is part of the English Studies. All of them work on one particular project that they'll be talking about later on, but let me just take a couple of minutes and introduce their own individual research. So Raymond is a doctoral student at the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, and his research focuses on identity politics and its ramifications on political, economic, and sociocultural development in Africa and African diaspora in the United States. Jack, on the other hand, is also a PhD candidate whose work has been on the examination of intersections of structural inequalities and income-generating behaviors in Havana, Cuba. He also works on other multidisciplinary projects that analyze relations between health vulnerabilities and social, political, and economic circumstances in other Caribbean spaces. Both or three of them belong to and are funding members of the project that we're talking about, as I said, the project that is called Greetings Covidians. And I would like to invite you to talk about the project.
Great, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, speaking on behalf of our broader research team, which is actually about 10 full members. And some other people have helped us along the way, which I'll give a special thanks to at the end of our talk here. Raymond is continuing to try to log back on. I think that this is, a normal procedure now that we all have in this new Zoom world that we live in. So once he's able to log back on, he'll be able to give some comments. And also, I want to give a special thanks to Farah, who submitted the initial abstract for this presentation. And really, without Farah's help, we wouldn't be here with you all today. So thank you, Farah. So let me go ahead and share my screen, hoping that I don't have any sort of technical difficulties. Okay, so I think that everybody should be seeing my a presentation view. Is that correct? Okay. Okay, so the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the array of impacts on individuals and societies defies simple narrative or analysis that compartmentalizes people's experiences and knowledge into any discrete field of discipline or geopolitical borders. As a crisis phenomenon, the nature of the pandemic, coupled with its attendant debilitating effects, have exposed varying degrees of vulnerabilities that have demanded innovative responses, oftentimes taking shape in compassionate forms of behavior. Cognizant of the inadequacies of any attempt to deploy bordered approaches to the study of this global health crisis, our research adopts multidisciplinary participatory visual methods in an attempt to empower people to express themselves in ways that best present their own narratives of the world around them. The underlying goal of this methodological approach is to uncover the nature, the effects, and the responses of the COVID-19 pandemic beyond visible and imaginary boundaries like those we see in academic silos or within nation-state borders. What we discovered through the ultimate product of our research initiative, which was a growing living gallery of participant photos, like the one we see here on the right, and which I will describe in just a moment, was that people are adamant about sharing not only the negative consequences of the pandemic, but perhaps even more importantly, their innovative and often compassionate responses. As we describe below, we argue that these responses and the photos that encapsulate them are profound depictions of how people have experienced, responded to, and explained the pandemic in individualized, interpersonal, and collective ways. So, we invite you to come along as we discover two of the emerging themes we have identified in this participatory research, namely vulnerabilities and compassion. So for the outline for the presentation, we will first describe the multidisciplinary methodologies we adapted from the onset of the pandemic and which ultimately led to the analyses formed in this presentation. Then for the bulk of our time here, we'll focus on two themes that emerge within our data. First, on the topic of vulnerability and how it reveals itself in individualized and societal ways. Then on how people have responded to their vulnerable circumstances in individual and collectively compassionate ways. The primary goal of the second analysis is to describe the positive ways that people responded to this dark moment in history. We find this important because we think that positive, compassionate resilience is often overlooked in favor of more fatalistic or negative interpretations of the pandemic. And then we conclude with a brief discussion of how compassion, much like vulnerability, can transcend borders. So at the onset of the pandemic, when social distancing guidelines were in full effect, our research team decided to build an online platform and virtual gallery for people to share photos and description of their experiences with the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated health and safety protocols. We titled the project Greetings COVIDians because we knew we were entering a new, perhaps even foreign or otherworldly realm of existence. Greetings COVIDian was envisioned as an adaptation of Photo Voice, a participatory visual research method in which community members use photography, discussions, and captions to analyze their daily realities and advocate for public dialogue and social and policy changes. In order to adhere to social distancing guidelines and to make the opportunity to participate in the project available to anyone and everyone, in this first phase of the research, we forewent photography and critical analysis workshops that are usually present in more sort of traditional Photo Voice projects. Instead, we gathered photographs and captions through an online call for submissions that we then uploaded into a living gallery with the hopes that the online forum would encourage critical thought and perhaps discussions based around what viewers saw in the gallery and shared with their immediate social circles. Later, we did draw upon our research team's connections to some community-based organizations, and we were fortunate to eventually conduct two Photo Voice projects with people living with HIV/AIDS and people experiencing homelessness in Miami. And the screenshot on the bottom right is of one of those meetings. So just so you know, while the bulk of the photos in this presentation are from the more general project, there are a few photos from those two more focused Photo Voice projects that we conducted virtually. So in the call for submissions for the initial general project, which you can see here on the left side of the screen, participants were asked to submit a photo, title, and caption that described their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. The call was intentionally left open. That is, there was no thematic focus beyond COVID-19 in general, which allowed participants to guide the direction and focus of the broader research project. We encouraged people to look through their camera rolls and submit photos they had already taken and which they thought were interesting to share with other people around the world, or to think about something that they wanted to share and then create an interesting photo and caption to convey that message. Overall, we hoped the Greetings COVIDians participatory research project and virtual gallery, shown here on the bottom right, would create a cathartic experience by allowing artist participants a place to critically reflect, process, and view the changes happening not only in their daily lives, but also other people's lives during COVID-19. We also wanted to empower the broader community to make their own interpretations and amplify their unique perceptions of the ongoing global pandemic and the nuanced ways it was personally impacting their lives. So I wanted to give everyone a link to the gallery that if you're interested, you can take a look at later on. So I'm going to, well, looks like I can't put it into the Q&A. But what I'll try to do is I'll try to send it to the directors of this conference to then pass on to individuals if they're so interested. And this is an ongoing project. So if you'd like to, we'd love for you to contribute to the conversation, providing a photo and a caption of the different changes that you've experienced or that you've witnessed in your own lives. So the concept of vulnerability has received a wide range of scholarly attention from different disciplinary fields with commonly acceptable definitions. The term generally defines the potential for loss and the susceptibility of being harmed by disastrous occurrences and related conditions. Some scholars define vulnerability as the characteristics of a person or a group and their situations that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from natural disasters, or in this case, public health disasters. Susan Cutter adds to these definitions by outlining two instances of vulnerability. personal and social vulnerabilities. She explains that personal vulnerabilities reveal potential losses or harm that have both individualized spatial and non-spatial domains. Social vulnerability, on the other hand, includes the susceptibility of social groups or society at large to potential losses from hazardous events and disasters. So what I also want to call attention to is this third one, which is the idea of a syndemic or a cumulative vulnerability. And that's something that we'll describe in a little bit more with a little bit of help from the photos in our gallery. But basically, what we have witnessed through these gallery photos is that we have different forms of vulnerability that are being shaped by the pandemic as a whole and some of the socioeconomic, racial, gendered, age circumstances that exist around and within the pandemic. So with these parameters in mind, and based on the data gathered in the form of photographs with captions about people's experiences during COVID-19, we discovered three interconnected expressions of vulnerabilities. First is individual/personal vulnerabilities. Second is social or collective vulnerabilities. And third is syndemic or cumulative vulnerabilities. And if questions remain after this presentation, we'd love to hear from the audience and be happy to clarify anything or engage in a conversation with you all about these sorts of vulnerabilities. But getting into these, the photos and captions that I'll show you today express the diverse ways different individuals have become more susceptible to either contracting the virus or suffering damaging effects of the virus due to their particular health, sociocultural, economic, political, etc. circumstances. And according to Neil Adger, individual vulnerability is determined by access to resources and the diversity of income sources, as well as by social status of individuals or households within a community. The notion of individual vulnerability, however, leaves out some crucial factors being experienced during COVID-19. And this photo here helps explain that. So there are age conditions and heightened anxiety and stress associated with adhering to prescribed health safety protocols. Indeed, social distancing orders have significantly affected different individuals depending on their unique intersectionalities or positionalities. For example, the case is severe for the elderly whose susceptibility to contracting the virus is higher compared to younger people. As a result, some families within our gallery had to isolate themselves from their older age parents to avoid putting them at risk. And when they did visit, they did so with anxiety, as we can see here. So this expression of individual vulnerability is shown here in this photo entitled Peace, Love, and Face Masks. And the caption says, "This is my mom posing in a face mask she was given for Mother's Day 2020. We spent an anxious afternoon gathering as a group of 5 for the first time since the pandemic began." I'm sure that this is, a common feeling or raises common feelings for a lot of us looking at this photo. According to other scholars, it is also anticipated that that we as humans will be faced with a mental health pandemic as a result of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and that exists, across borders. So this observation was vividly captured in this photo here titled Anxiety. The photo is a reflection, as the artist participant says, the photo is a reflection of my new reality. Anxiety is my new norm. I find myself getting these anxious attacks even when I tried to fool my mind. Before COVID-19, I wasn't familiar with this feeling. While the previous photo of the older woman with her mask expresses vulnerability to the virus due to age, this photo shows how individuals have become vulnerable as a result of adhering to the COVID-19 health and safety protocols, and regardless of age. So our artist participants also express their experiences of vulnerabilities in ways we identify as collective or social vulnerabilities. This type of vulnerability defines groups of people's conditions of extreme susceptibility to harm due to systemic, structural, and institutional marginalization based on race, economic, religious, political, and immigrant status. It must be stated that these systems of social segregation and related consequences have been expressed by different individuals and groups since time immemorial. However, the existence of systemic structures and their instrumentalities in perpetuating these marginalized conditions have either been denied or downplayed. The outbreak of COVID-19 and the need to observe prescribed self-safety protocols have in many ways exposed some invisible borders that stratify contemporary societies. Inability of these marginalized groups to access necessities such as sustained supply of food and decent shelter during lockdown periods further show their extreme vulnerability to contract the virus as well as suffer related consequences, including loss of life. The societal vulnerability due to job insecurity, sustainable income, and absence of adequate food to feed and shelter to accommodate deprived communities was only heightened during COVID-19. These cases of vulnerabilities have been expressed in diverse ways through photos and captions submitted by our participants. In this photo, entitled "Hanging in My Mask," the artist participant expressed his vulnerability as a person experiencing homelessness who lived in a homeless shelter where social distance is often impossible. Hence the need to improvise with his bunk bed that serves as a place for both social distancing and staying at home. And I know this individual personally, and he communicated to me that he actually had to do this because there were about 15 to 20 people living in the same bunk room as him. And so he was afraid that he would be susceptible to the coronavirus during different times. So for the sake of time, I need to move past some of these slides, but I would like to just demonstrate a few of them. So this is another photo here, and I think that this cat acts as a nice metaphor for some of the susceptibilities and vulnerabilities that people face. As we can see here, the caption says, "This homeless cat and the gang were waiting for food at the back of one restaurant, but the restaurant was closed and locked down because of COVID-19. Stay home if you're sick to save more life." And this leads us into this idea of syndemic or cumulative vulnerabilities. So the term syndemic refers to aggregated or synergistic epidemics. Here we use the term syndemic to describe multiple intersecting realities and the outcomes of naturally and socially induced conditions individuals and groups suffer concurrently. The idea of syndemic vulnerabilities illustrates some of the life-threatening conditions some people had to endure in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. One example of a syndemic vulnerability that was discussed by our participants is the idea of living with HIV/AIDS and having to deal with the coronavirus. So in this photo, we see a regimen of health and safety protocols that an individual had to partake in order to maintain themselves fighting against both HIV as well as the coronavirus. So we can see the table is full of all of these things that the participant had to use. Another revealing expression of syndemic vulnerability is captured in this artist participant's photo entitled "Racism is a Public Health Issue." This photo presents a narrative consistent with emerging research findings about the correlation between race and the impacts of COVID-19 on different populations. And so I'm going to leave it there. And with this photo, I'm going to begin to talk a little bit about compassion, because I'm looking at my time here and realizing that I'm running out of it. So building off of what were Raymond's, even though I was talking about them, Raymond's astute observations of how the pandemic has resulted in various vulnerabilities across diverse spectrums, what I want to do now is show you some of the positivity that arose out of the gallery. The reason being is that I feel that we have so often focused on negative circumstances. And of course, this is rightfully so, because of the profound impacts inequities and inequalities have had not only during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also across history. Nevertheless, I also find it useful to uncover or highlight the powerful ways that people have stood up to their circumstances and found opportunities for growth despite the hardships around them. So within this section, I'm going to let some of the photos and captions speak for themselves. I'll give a brief overview right now of how we're defining compassion, which is a cognitive, affective, and behavioral process consisting of recognizing suffering, emotional resonance, and then acting, I underline that, acting to alleviate suffering. And then I'm going to get into 3 different examples of this. So compassion towards oneself, which is sort of your typical form of compassion. We identified forms of collective compassion or group responses to suffering and pain. And we also identified moments and instances of self-compassion, which is reflexive, thoughtful compassion towards oneself. Again, I'm happy to clarify or discuss these within the Q&A section if people are interested. So in the next few slides, we'll see some instances of compassions directed towards others. And since this is a participatory project, I'm going to let the photos and the captions really speak for themselves. Here we have a photo, the new normal. The person writes, "I'm a professor at FIU, and I give my senior students a graduation gift as a tradition. This was for spring 2020, the first semester I couldn't hand them their gift on our last class meeting. Instead, I mailed the gifts out to them, and I've been doing so ever since classes have been remote. To me, this is a powerful representation of the ways that we have continued our compassion through the pandemic, despite all the hardships that we've confronted. Here we have another photo titled "Don't Close the Door." A clean, comfortable place to rest feels vital, and the division between the inside and outside necessary. But finding solace in the boundary makes me question my empathy and compassion, especially when there are so many people who lack the same luxuries. Shutting the screen is okay, but don't close the door. So here we have someone fighting with this idea of compassion and how to still remain compassionate while protecting themselves and their own family. And this right here, silent missive. So I don't often order food delivered during a pandemic, but when I do, it's after 11 p.m. and I need a quick fix. As the driver instructed on the app to leave the food without knocking, got in his car and drove off, I was left with the packaging to deal with. With a quick few moments, the contents were out and the paper discarded, left on the ground outside the front door overnight. When I went to toss the bag the next day, I noticed the letters, words that had escaped me the previous night. Ánimo, vendrán días mejores. Take hope, better days will come. I felt sick. A whim of mine was preserving a local business, but putting the writer in harm's way, one I felt a stinging kinship with, like an arm reaching through barbed wire to grasp freedom. Safe human contact, now more sparse and suspicious than any of us could ever conceived of. The message was a touching and bittersweet sign of faith in faithless times. So in this way, we see a combination of empathy on the sense of the consumer and a compassionate act on the sense of the driver who left this meaningful note for this person. Here we have some instances of collective compassion. So in this photo titled Undeveloped America, we see an instance of people volunteering. So helping each other, forming as a group and helping each other in a time of need. Another instance of volunteering in this photo titled Windows Up. And in this photo, Portland protests compelled me to leave my bubble, shows instances of people taking to the streets despite the health risks that were existing in order to fight for social justice and racial equality. And finally, we have some instances of self-compassion. So social distancing 101, these individuals went walking every day in order to maintain their own social health and fight themselves against what we call in the United States cabin fever. Here we have what you do with your space is solely up to you. Some see blank space, others see a canvas. So this individual took to creating art as a form to manage their mental health and anxiety. This supported yoga pose helped me breathe when I had COVID. This person actually contracted COVID-19 and took care of themselves through compassionate forms of physicality. And here we have rowing at daybreak. This individual, because they weren't able to go to the gym to compassionately take care of themselves like they had done in the past, they took to walking down the streets of their local area and taking photos that they would then share with their family to communicate the different ways that they were handling the pandemic. So in conclusion, what we've discovered through our analysis of these participatory photographs is that while yes, there's much to document with regards to vulnerabilities, inequities, and inequalities, there's also much to gain from discovering the compassionate perspectives of people experiencing the pandemic around the world. Some people have taken a moment to adapt their lifestyles. Others have gone to the streets to help others in need or fight for social justice. The individuals who chose to use their platform to reveal or at least comment on situations of vulnerability and precarity also laid the foundation for future compassionate action. Both sets of individuals are paramount to making progress on the world we had when we entered this pandemic. And as Raymond pointed out through our discussions together, varying degrees of retrospection and introspection are necessary to identify pathways forward. I think what's important to take away from this presentation is that the importance of utilizing multidisciplinary methods and the need to explore the novel coronavirus phenomenon from a visual perspective revealed how our research just in general can transcend boundaries, not only in the composition of our research teams, the methodologies we've used, the locations in our study, but also the participants involved and the audiences who have taken the time to interact with the photos in our gallery. So we end on this photo and caption because it's a powerful representation and reminder that acts of compassion emerge from conscientious recognition of the challenges that lie behind us and in front of us, and to also take a moment to appreciate the people around the world who are doing their part to affect positive change. While COVID-19 may never truly leave us, much like cumulative syndemics like racism or other health crises, We can always take a moment to reflect on, acknowledge, and draw inspiration from the social justice and public health warriors who continue to risk their lives to make the world a better place. And with that, I just want to take one brief second to recognize the other members of the research team, the research departments at FIU who made this research possible, other research institutions who we have connections to, and most importantly, all of the participants who made this research possible. So thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.